no better person to talk to you about this than Ian Acheson, who is the author of Screwed on the prisons. He is a prison service expert, having been a former governor. He's also a counter-terrorism expert. Ian, what do you think of what Jonathan Hall has said? It's not exactly pro-Keir Starmer.
No, I agree with what Jonathan Hall has said. We already have a definition of terrorism in the Terrorism Act 2000, and that's the use or the threat of violence to further a political, religious, or ideological cause. So it's clear, and Jonathan Hall is saying that can't be expanded. Why is he saying it can't be expanded? Well, there's three things really that he was talking about that I agree with him on. So first of all, there's the risk of overreach. If you expand that definition, as the Prime Minister was suggesting, you might have lots of false positives, potentially prosecuting individuals who aren't terrorists and risking abuse of the anti-terror laws. You've got freedom of expression concerns. Widening the scope might, as he says, impose unacceptable restrictions on freedom of expression. So I think he used the example, Peter, of sharing violent content and being penalised for it without any actual terrorist intent. And the third thing is arguably the most important thing, and that is mission creep and resource strain. I mean, he argues that an expanded definition could overwhelm the police and the security services, diverting resources and attention from existing threats without adequate support. And that really is a big problem. If you look at, lots of incidents that fall into the terrorism definition or fall outside it. And actually, Rudakubana is a very interesting example of a kind of neither fish nor fowl kind of offence. It was an atrocity. It had elements of terroristic behaviour, certainly. People were terrorised, children were murdered. Some of the offences he was charged with relate to terrorism, they're connected. Others weren't, in the absence of any clear, coherent ideology. But, as I've said to you before, the dead are just as dead. The problem is here, and it's been said before, if everything becomes extremism, nothing is. And we run a real danger of expanding that, mission creep, or that definition so much, it becomes impossible to police it.
Tell me your thoughts on what Jonathan Hall said about Southport itself, because there were so many people saying, just give us basic information in regard to Southport, all sorts of misinformation, but it came essentially from, well, many would argue that it came from the government, actually, the misinformation, not from other places. And actually, if people had just been levelled with and treated like adults in the first place, a lot of people think that actually maybe the riots wouldn't have happened, or maybe that level of anger wouldn't have happened. What do you think of that?
I agree pretty much with that. I mean, Jonathan and I were both on Panorama a couple of weeks ago, being interviewed about the Southport atrocity. And effectively, we said the same thing. The void of silence that happened after the attack was committed was probably motivated by the best of intentions, but that was a completely wrong-headed desire to maintain what the police would describe as community cohesion. And it's a paradox, really, that it had the absolute opposite effect. It allowed misinformation and disinformation to fill that gap. There were all sorts of things that were then propagated in social media immediately. Went round the world twice before the truth had its boots on, as the saying goes, about the fact he was a Muslim immigrant, I think, and various things like that. And I think the public were not treated properly. We're not treated in an adult way, and as Jonathan has said, we're not given immediate information, in a sober way that might have had the intent of shutting down some of the awful disturbances that we've seen. And in fact, I think it's worse than that in a way. And the public inquiry is likely to surface this. I think there was a deliberate attempt by Merseyside police to obfuscate some of the details about Rudakubana.
Why would that
aggravated it?
Okay, give me your thoughts on why you think that happened. What would, you're saying sometimes there were perhaps bad motivations that shouldn't have been correct. Was this in an experienced government? Was it a security service that was too cautious? What will have been the stages that will have gone through there from your expertise to say, actually, Prime Minister or whoever, or police service, this shouldn't be in the public domain?
Well, Peter, we're both from Northern Ireland. You know the expression, whatever you say nothing.
Nothing.
I mean, I do think some of that was being deployed. It obviously, to be fair to Merseyside Police, it was a fast-moving and dynamic situation, but I think it was badly mishandled. And again, I suggest, in the misplaced interest of community cohesion, different aspects of characteristics that were known were left out, or open to misinterpretation, shall we say. And then that was, in the continuing void after the initial attack had happened, that was capitalized on by people who were saying, we're being taken for fools here. Here's the real story. Of course, all those allegations turned out to be false. But the rabbit was out of the hat, or the genie was out of the bottle long before then. And one of Jonathan's points he makes is that kind of response is obsolete in the age of social media, where you have instantaneous information and misinformation and willful disinformation going out about these attacks. If the police had said, as Jonathan had said, we don't believe that this attack is terrorist motivated immediately, and had they said some more about the characteristics of the perpetrator, it is arguable that a lot of the social unrest that did, completely unacceptable social unrest, by the way, that did emanate from that silence could have been stopped. And I hope some of that is discussed openly at the public inquiry. And I hope then the police get better advice on balancing public interest with the need to protect a dynamic and fast developing situation where they simply don't know all of the information straight away.
Will this be corrected, do you think, because of this? Will the mythical lessons be learned from in terms of the amount of information that was put in the public domain? Because had all the information, or some of it anyway, that what Jonathan Hall argues anyway actually wouldn't have prejudiced the trial because it's factual information, things might have been very different.
Well, I think you've got some cultural issues to tackle, not just inside police constabularies, but inside the Crown Prosecution Service. Merseyside Police were very quick to say we were constrained in what we could say because of issues relating to contempt of court, and we were being advised by the CPS on what we could and couldn't say. That obviously does need to change. But to your point, I'd be quite interested in an investigation that says, why do we never learn in relation to terrorist attacks lessons that should be learned? Because there's a history of repeated failure in relation to the management of and the prevention of terrorism and the prevention of extremism. That is a whole other aspect of what Jonathan Hall was saying. And he argues correctly, I think, and I've been arguing about it for years, for the creation of an independent resource that the police and possibly other protective agencies can be involved in, that is able to spot and stop and manage the risk of people who don't cross that threshold of terrorism, but are nevertheless extremely dangerous because they're intent on trying to create mass casualty attacks, which of course, the dead are just as dead no matter which side of this equation you stand on. The damage is just as awful and the consequences are just as severe to society. But it is a blind spot I think we have. Our defences are weak in that area. So I think it's quite right that we focus on creating structures and agencies that are able to look in that space to deal with people who represent that sort of risk.
Ian, thank you very much indeed. That is Ian Acheson there. He is a counter-terrorism and prison safety expert.